Many leaders start as experts and are promoted to a leadership role, but that does not prepare them to be a leader. Bill Treasurer has written 2 words at a time. What playbook has he written for leaders to succeed? Welcome to the Excellent Executive Coaching Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Katrina Burrus, and today we're going to be interviewing Bill Treasurer. Bill, welcome.
Dr. Burrus, thank you so much for having me out here on Excellent Executive Coaching. I do quite a bit of executive coaching, so I'm looking forward to spending time with you and your listeners.
Wonderful. Now, you've written a book called Leadership 2 Worlds at a Time, Simple Truths for Leading Complicated People. So what got you interested in that field?
During the pandemic, I took time off like a lot of people did. And after a while, things started to stir inside of me and another book decided to come out. And I decided to write a book based on the audiences that I most often work with. I'm pretty fortunate that I get to work with leaders all the time, just as you do, and many executive coaches do as well. And I work with new leaders that are making that transition from individual contributor to being in a leadership role. And it's a bumpy transition. And I thought, what would help those people, those folks that are going through that transition? Because later in life, what we hear, and I'm sure that you sometimes hear this from more senior leaders, is nobody handed me a playbook when I moved into a leadership role. So I started thinking about what would a playbook be for new leaders to help them transition, and Leadership 2 Words at a Time came out.
I see. So you write about 3 areas of leadership fitness. What would you say they are, and why did you choose those in particular?
When I was writing the book, I know that leadership can be overwhelming. There's a lot that you're responsible for. There are a lot of people who are counting on you, your bosses, the people that you're leading, your peers, the company, your clients, your customers. And you can get subsumed by all the responsibilities and all the different things you're expected to do as a leader. And I wanted to remove some of the burden for the new leader and say, listen, just think about the essentials. Think about the fundamentals. If you do nothing else, at least do these 3 things. Now, they're big umbrellas. There's a lot of stuff that goes under each one of these 3 things, but they are 3 essential 2-word concepts. The first is you've got to lead yourself really well in a disciplined way. Second, you've got to lead people, and that's different than leading yourself. It's a whole different skill set. And third, you've got to lead work. You do the first 2, personal discipline and leading others, so that you get results. So you've got to understand the business that you're operating in and lead work. But if you do those 3 things, lead yourself, lead others, and lead work, there's a pretty good probability that you're going to be a good leader.
I agree. What are you hoping that leaders come away with from reading this book?
A lot of leaders, when they move into a leadership role for the first time, they kind of freak out. The honeymoon lasts only for a little while. They start to realize, wait a minute, you put me in a leadership role because I had a certain technical or operational brilliance. You saw what I was good at in terms of the job that I did in terms of my production. But you didn't tell me that half of my job was going to be a part-time psychiatrist. And so leaders, as they move into that new leadership role, they get, disillusioned pretty quickly and they start to flounder. What I hope is that this book removes some of the burden, lightens some of the load so that they can actually become more effective at doing those 3 things, leading themselves, leading people, and leading work, but they actually start to enjoy the act of leading. That's my hope, is that they become more effective while they're enjoying leading.
So how do you lighten the burden?
I lighten the burden by saying, look, of all of these different things that you could be doing and have to attend to, focus on the 2 words right in front of you. What is the situation you're dealing with right now? And then use these 2-word concepts. So there's all sorts of 2-word concepts in the book that instead of taking on the panoramic view of all the hundreds of things that you could be focusing on as a leader, focus on these 2 words right in front of you that you can put in service of whatever the perplexing situation is. And how I landed on 2 words, and you probably find this too, Katrina, in your coaching practice, and maybe some of your coaches do as well, the executive coaches that listen to this podcast, is that I find that if a coachee can narrow in the fewest amount of words and really laser in on what the situation is that they're contending with, and more importantly, the specific actions that they can take to resolve the situation, if they do it in the fewest amount of words, it brings clarity to them, and the probability of them actually taking action goes up. So I'll give you a specific example if I can. I was working with a leader who was an associate partner, and he really, really wanted to be a partner in this firm. But the partners themselves would tell me, he's so intense. He's so desperate to be a partner that he gives off this intense vibe, and we're not sure we actually want him to be a partner. In working with him as a coachee, I said, what do you think the partners need? What do they want to see from you? And what do you need to? And here's the thing, give me it in the fewest amount of words. And he said, I think I probably need calm, confidence. I need to be calm and composed, and I need to have confidence. And I thought, bing, it's exactly what he needed. And so he started working on calm confidence in his demeanor. And then when he'd get ready to go and see them and be with those senior executives, he'd send me a text and say, all right, Bill, I'm getting ready to go with the partners. I'm going to use my CC, my calm confidence. And it became much easier than if he had like 100 different things to be thinking about, or take some personality survey and make him change his personality. If he could just focus on calm confidence, that was a high leverage thing that could bring about the personality and behavioral change to help him get where he wanted to go.
Wonderful. I had some similar experience, but with a Chinese person that worked in Switzerland, and they weren't confident about promoting him. So instead of, like you did, is go and find out how he's perceived. And the Westerners, they position themselves as a leader, They have to say their word, they interrupt, they speak loudly, which was everything contrary to the way he was educated. But when you can bring that back to say, okay, you are too calm. You don't position yourself in leadership in Europe. This is how they perceive a good leader. The behavior change did happen. So you make a very good point.
Right. I just think that to laser in, and a lot of the lessons that we learn coming up as a leader, I think one of the first lessons that I learned when I worked at Accenture, and this is some 20 years ago, 25 years ago, before I started my company, I learned that one of the partners said to me, one of the first rules of leadership around here is, and he said, no surprises, no surprises. And I said, well, what does that mean? He said, that means that if there is a problem that you're starting to face, instead of trying to be heroic and solve it all yourself, bring me in early. Don't throw me a meteorite when the problem is starting to blow up for me to come into the situation. Inform me early, and that's what I mean by no surprises. And I've never forgotten that simple 2-word lesson, which is conveyed to many people in many workforces. And so I think sometimes as leaders, we should spend less time complexifying things and much more time simplifying concepts. The concept underneath it may have a lot of complexity to it, but if you can give it a header, a title that is memorable, it removes some of the burden of the person who's having to contend with it.
And like you mentioned, it makes it like accessible, easier to do. It's perceived as such.
Yes.
So
much more memorable.
Okay, so in this fellow, you gave the calm confidence so that he could change his behavior in front of the partners and they would be more comfortable in promoting him to partner. What would you say to yourself, or what would you suggest to these leaders when they feel super angry, frustrated, and emotionally charged?
What I would say is that reasonability means a lot to leadership. Every human being has emotions that can sometimes, me, myself, have emotions that can get triggered and can run away with us. And we can become, and the word that I've heard some people use is inebriated. We can become drunk with our emotions, and now our emotions start to control us. And the challenge is when you're in a leadership role, that can do a lot of damage to the people that you're leading and bring you a lot of unhappiness. So 2 words that I have around this, and it's in the book as one of the chapters, is cultivate composure. It's much healthier to come at a place of groundedness and stability so that you can bring your adulthood into leading. In the workplace, there are days that it's going to be insane at work. But you don't have to bring the insanity or feed the insanity through your short fuse or your anger. So part of it's about stress management. And part of it is, how do you start your day? How do you ease into your day with thoughtfulness, some reflection, a meditative moment, silence first? If you can do that instead of turning on blasting the radio on your way to work or listening to some angertainment, often in times of political divisiveness, that stuff just puts anger inside of you and makes you a fast trigger. So reasonability, you can cultivate composure and think of it as, how do you ease yourself into your day?
Do you have any advice? Okay, so you're easing yourself into the day. You have maybe meditation or you listen to quiet music or other elements you suggest. And what about during the day? Because sometimes, something happens and you're triggered.
Yes. Yes. Well, a lot of times when you are triggered, as I illustrate this when I talk, and I'm doing it now, actually live when I talk to you, when I bring this point into groups that I'm working with, groups of leaders, I'll take my hand and I'll start rattling it. And I'll say, what happens when you are rattled, like my hand is triggering right now, and it's going back and forth like a rattlesnake? When you're rattled, how do you respond to the person who might have triggered you? And people will say, really curt in my behavior, really disproportional. I become heavy-handed. I become very abrupt and I'm like, okay, so what's the first thing you need to do before you respond to whatever the trigger is? And they'll say, rightly so, stop the rattling. That's the first thing I have to do. So when I get triggered, you have to make this disconnected moment. That you take the word responsibility and you break it into two words. Am I response-able? If you can disconnect the moment between the trigger and your response to the trigger, you have a certain degree of freedom. So a couple of ways you can do that. The most obvious way that people often talk about is, first take a couple of deep breaths. One thing that I do personally is that if I find I'm getting what I would call tight in that moment, tight with my own anger, becoming sort of ready to explode, I'll go to the restroom and wash my hands under cold water. If it's a really tight situation, I might have to take a walk around the building to decompress and let the stress that's in me out of me, the urge to purge. I've got to get what's inside of me outside of me. But I think it's just really partly just catching yourself so that when you're in that triggered moment, you recognize, okay, I feel the trigger. I'm registering it in my body. What do I need to do to take a beat and disconnect between the trigger and my response to the trigger?
Right, great suggestions. Sometimes I have them think through what is the response, the outcome they want. And is that response the best way to get the desired outcome? So they put their brain into another space and the outcome. Very interesting. So how long have you been working with leaders? And finally, what triggered you to write this book?
Yeah. So I've been working with leaders in my company. So I've had my company, it turned 20 in August. So I'm in the 21st year now. And before that, I was with Accenture, one of the world's largest management consulting companies. And actually, I was their first full-time internal executive coach. That's what I did for my job. And then before that, I was with a company called Executive Adventure. Was there for 3 years. Before that, a smaller boutique consulting company, still around, called High Performing Systems. And before that, graduate school. So it's about 30 years that I've been working directly with leaders day in, day out. And then this book decided to come out of me. In fact, Katrina, I hadn't had any plans to write a book during COVID. In fact, I was pretty sure I wasn't going to. But the book I write on, the muses have to speak to me. The sirens have to be singing. Something has to come out of me. And I was sort of recognizing there's a need for this book, a playbook for new leaders, and that I had some things to say. I feel like now I've said all I need to say about leadership. When you cover, you got to lead yourself, and the 6 chapters in there and the chapters under here's how you lead others and here's what you've got to be mindful about while you lead work. I feel like I've said what I need to say about leadership. And in fact, if I write another organizational development book, it almost gets back to what we just talked about. It would probably be called The Beat. I think it's taking that beat when you are in a triggered moment. How do I disconnect and just take a beat before I respond? that it makes a huge difference to leadership. So that's a little bit about how long I've been working with leaders and what compelled me to write the book and where I think I'm going to go next with the next book.
So where would that be? I got a preview.
Yeah, you got a preview of that book with The Beat. It may not be the best title, but that's what I want to come away with people is some leaders, if they are explosive, if they are short-tempered, if they have a fast fuse, if they could just take a beat before they respond to whatever they're feeling the trigger is and move in to a thoughtful space, as you suggest, and think about the outcome that they're trying to get. And if they don't move into that space, to think about the consequences if they behave out of the trigger, the damage that it's likely to do. I think that can make a huge difference on leaders, is just to take a beat so they can pull back into composure and be emotionally sober instead of emotionally inebriated.
Yeah, they say emotional intelligence is really the first step, is to be able to have self-awareness, self-control.
Yes. It starts with that. I've got to be able to be aware of my own emotional condition and then have ways to temper down and simmer it, my emotional condition, basically put it under my control. And then if I'm good at that, I also have to be able to register what the emotional condition I perceive the other person is having. And do I have strategies and techniques for sometimes decompressing their emotional condition? So you're right. It has everything to do with emotional intelligence.
Yes. Well, where can people get a hold of your book?
The best way would be any online retailer is going to be able to have my book. And then they could also go to couragebuilding.com, and that'll take them to my company, and all my books are out there and links to other places they can get them.
So I'll tell our listeners, the book's title is Leadership 2 Words at a Time. Simple Truths for Leading Complicated People. Thank you very, very much, Bill. Thank you.
And Dr. Burris, my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me on.
And I encourage everyone to purchase his book. Good. Great value. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Excellent Executive Coaching Podcast. You can subscribe to all future podcasts at excellentexecutivecoaching.com. Join us each Wednesday to learn more about the latest trends in leadership techniques and bring your coaching to the next level. To learn more about Dr. Burris's CEO Mastermind, use the contact form at excellentexecutivecoaching.com.